in the scheme of tradition and heritage. The scholastic custodians inaugurated a laborious task of collecting, preserving, annotating, commenting, rather than simply making the new dawn upon us. In fact, as a student of intellectual and cultural history of, as I mentioned, certain inclinations, one is bound to think that newness or novelty is the most beautiful and perhaps useful fictions we live with. The time we live in is only the past or the future. The present or the now is just the recognition of this very fact. The novelty then is either an understanding of the past or the anticipation of the moment to come, that is the future. So let me propose that the humanities, as we try to think about it, is based on basically three major factors. One is that it is linguistically, what is linguistically available to us, philology, that's the technical name, and the rise of humanities in the Western modern academy. The areas of inquiry such as Orientalism, Sinology, Egyptology are the offshoots of the Western philological humanism. The second is the very idea of distance or the otherness, which are the prerequisites for all self-reflexivity. It could be in relation to one's own past or the societies which are supposed to be linked to larger imagination of humanity. And thirdly, the very idea of the human itself, which is the product of the story of the rise of the human sciences. The problem of thinking about humanities in the disciplinary sense, since we are sitting in a university, in a non-Western context, is that it is seen as emerging from within the rise of the story of humanities in the West. Our newness in our humanities has to engage with this long intellectual cultural process. The process is that the very idea of humanity which is available to us is actually coming from a certain intellectual tradition, which is largely the Western tradition. It requires us to tell ourselves the stories of wrecks, continuities, and survivals of the ways in which our kind of humanity could be imagined. These will also be the stories through which we would be able to see the cultural process and the literary, aesthetic, and human expressions, which are not necessarily tied to the national myths and configurations. Philology of the 19th century was able to mark language with ethnic peculiarities. The literatures and creative faculties belonged to the national languages. In short, the modern human was owned up by the national cultures. It was a formalist strand of criticism in arts and literature or structuralist influences in the social sciences in the first half of the 20th century, which saw or tried to showcase a new kind of human beyond the pale of nations or ethnicities. There were universal rules to human creativity and understanding which were being established during this period. The idea of the human universal was more of a shared faculty, since all creative and social processes were found to be equally complex, from high industrial complexes in the modern Western world to the Amazon forests. But the inquiries around human faculty and formations through which the humans acted and reached a curious limit in this century, the mid-20th century, what is later called the trap of reflexivity or self-reflexivity. The moment of acquiring wisdom about oneself or one's own existence in networks of groups and communities is never a neutral moment. The reflection is thus transformation. The much fashionable term post-human, or many such post-terms, had a humbler beginning. It was an attempt to see what is called the human as a web of meanings. It was turning itself back to the concept That was the very concept of the human, and which was created with much rigor in the high noon of Western Enlightenment and early modern period, which Prasanta and also Milind talked about. What we have seen of late in the last quarter of 20th century and the passing decade of the new century is a sudden resurgence of a lot of messy theories around the human process, vitality, and so on. I can give you a list which are fashionable these days. Very much the categories of a war-driven Europe. I know a bit of the caveats of these concepts simply because I do modern intellectual history and I have certain access to these things. We see a need to step out of the specter which is the human according to this schema, at least in the intellectual quarters which thrive in modern academic conventions, and they are fairly large and influential. But if you grant us at least a bit of leeway to think that there are several ways through which the human has been studied and shaped as a concept and idea, there are as many ways in which it makes itself possible also. Thinking of humanities in a post-colonial society like ours begins with identifying the following problems. And for me, post-colonial is just something which comes after colonialism. The first, the loss of language debate. And I think this is one ground from which we can start thinking about humanities in our context. So one can elaborate upon it and I can go in much detail on it. But I'm just flagging these problems, which I call as if the absence or loss of the language question. We are not talking about that. The second is it's a much deeper problem, but I try to engage it in my own way, which is that what is known as the possibility of theoretic common sense. Do we possess one? Do we have one? What are the possibilities of, or did we have one historically? That too is a big burden to prove on our part. And the third problem, which is very, very interesting, is the stories of our own humanism or humanisms between the worldly or otherwise, call it religious, poetic, aesthetic, transcendental, embedded. You can give as many words as possible. I invoke the idea of this idea of worldly in relation to humanism because we know that some of the really profound reflections on the question of humanities and humanism in the last century from the great philologists and humanists like Curtius and Auerbach and many of them. And that very tradition which comes to people like Edward Said, the term worldly was very, very important and it meant something very, very important here. But even with that worldly, I didn't use the word secular deliberately because I didn't want to conflate it. It's a much larger word. And together with the worldly, I'm using the religious, aesthetic, poetic, transcendent, embedded. But one of the deeper questions is about the second point which I mentioned about the theoretic common sense itself. Because that's the route to enter into the problem of humanities in our part of the world. Because that's what interests me. Where are the sources of post-colonial thinking and new disciplinary formations? What language, natural language, the languages which we speak, or language metaphorically, conceptual languages, and then conceptually do we speak in? Are the sources embedded in other traditions which the colonial, national, cultural, and intellectual formations pushed to the margins? Take the example of G.D. Koshambi's historiography, where he writes a series of essays on method, and they're very instructive essays because I've been back to some of them and trying to make sense of them, where he writes on the method of ideology and other things. Shamanism, traditions, intellectual traditions which are outside the pale of orthodox in the Brahmanical formations, as the new enlightenment. That is how we discovered a kind of enlightenment. Shamanic traditions were enlightenment traditions. Buddhism, more so than Jainism, which is philosophically very, very well seen as liberating in the late 19th century. You see that an emergence of this. The various kinds of knowledges, and finally, humanities about the affective or theoretic concepts, comes to the point of what I like to characterize as a demand for theoretical labor and affective comportment, which we in some senses are trying to talk about here. I believe that the newness in humanities has to be embedded and grounded, which is not to say it has to be indigenous or native, not at all. It has to, however, cohere. It has to be something which hangs together. It has to be contingent in that way. Let me, I'll give you an example in the end, but as an illustration. Let me reconstruct this theory of embeddedness and coherence of words or our existences, lives, by raising the issue about Archimedean points. You know, the Archimedes was looking for a point which is just there from which the word could be actually viewed, and what I call